Okay, strap yourselves in because today we're going deep, really deep, into some thought-provoking, maybe even a little controversial territory with Thomas Szass's Psychiatric Slavery.
Oh, definitely controversial.
We've got excerpts from the preface, and get this, the whole thing is anchored around this real legal case.
Yeah, the Kenneth Donaldson case.
The guy was locked up in a mental institution for, like, 15 years.
It's wild.
Yeah.
And Szass just jumps right in, comparing involuntary psychiatric treatment to, like, straight-up chattel slavery.
15 years. That's just, I don't know, mind-blowing. You really start to wonder, like, where's the line between treatment and control, you know? What about individual freedom?
And that's precisely what Szass wants us to wrestle with. He starts by quoting Alexis de Tocqueville, talking about state-sanctioned violence.
Wow.
It sets the stage for this, like, clash between individual liberty and the power of society, you know?
Yeah, you can tell right off the bat this isn't going to be a light conversation. He's not pulling any punches, is he?
Nope. He goes straight for the jugular. He defines slavery as control by imposed authority, emphasizing the deprivation of liberty, you know, without consent.
Right.
And then he argues, like point blank, that involuntary psychiatric interventions, especially locking people up in institutions, are a textbook example of that.
Heavy stuff. I mean, especially when you think about someone like Donaldson, labeled as mentally ill, locked away for years, and never even considered dangerous. Makes you think, who decides what's illness and what's just different?
That's a huge part of Szass's argument. He sees this disturbing parallel between how society justified, you know, historical chattel slavery and how they justify what he calls psychiatric slavery.
Oh, yeah.
Raises all these uncomfortable questions about, like, how we as a society dehumanize and control people who are seen as other.
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting, right? This idea of victimization that he talks about.
Exactly. Szass is basically saying we create this us versus them thing. We label certain groups as different, dangerous, or somehow less than human, and suddenly it's okay to control and oppress them.
And he's not just talking about slavery from way back when, right? He's applying this to how we treat the mentally ill today.
That's exactly his point. He believes labeling someone as mentally ill can be a way to silence dissent, push aside those who don't fit in, or take away their control in the name of treatment. And the Donaldson case becomes this, like, perfect example to examine this through.
Okay, so let's dig into Donaldson's story then.
Yeah.
Who was he, and how did he end up stuck in the system for so long?
Well, Kenneth Donaldson, he was a really interesting guy. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and they locked him up in a Florida institution for 15 years.
Wow.
But, get this, he was never found to be a danger to himself or anyone else.
Really?
And to make things even more complicated, he was a Christian Scientist. And Christian Scientists, they completely reject psychiatric treatment, you know, based on their religious beliefs.
So he's caught in this system that insists on treating him, even though he's totally against it. What a messed up situation.
Exactly. A total catch-22. And this is where his fight in the courts becomes so important. It went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Wow.
They ultimately upheld his right to be free as long as he wasn't dangerous.
That's a big deal. But then it gets even more confusing, right? Because this whole right to treatment thing comes up.
Oh, yeah. And that's where the Mental Health Law Project, MHLP, enters the picture. Now, you'd think a group like this, you know, supposedly advocating for patients, would be celebrating Donaldson getting out.
I would think so, yeah.
But they didn't. They actually backed his claim for the right to treatment while he was still locked up.
Wait, that doesn't make sense. Wouldn't they be fighting for his freedom first and foremost?
You would think, right. But their position was basically the same as the American Psychiatric Association. The APA believed that treatment, even involuntary, was good for him. They were saying it was in Donaldson's best interest to be treated, even if he didn't want it.
So Szass sees this right to treatment as like a trick, right? It sounds good, but it actually gives psychiatrists and institutions more power to control people.
That's exactly what he's saying. He calls it the right to treat, a power given to the people in charge, not a real right belonging to the patient.
And he uses the Donaldson case and all the arguments around it to really drive that point home.
Absolutely. He goes through all the legal briefs submitted to the Supreme Court by Donaldson, by O'Connor, that was the hospital superintendent, and by the APA. Each one shows how they saw the situation and what they wanted to happen.
So let's break down those briefs then. Starting with Donaldson's, how did he make his case?
Well, Donaldson's argument was all about his basic right to freedom. He said he was unjustly confined, that he posed no threat, and that they kept denying him release even though he asked repeatedly. His case really boils down to individual autonomy versus the state's power.
Like a classic David and Goliath story. And what about O'Connor, the guy in charge of the hospital? How did he justify keeping Donaldson locked up for so long?
O'Connor leaned heavily on Donaldson's diagnosis. He said that Donaldson refusing to admit he was sick and rejecting treatment proved he was mentally ill, and that's why they had to keep him confined.
That seems kind of circular, like you're sick because you don't agree that you're sick.
Exactly. And that's the kind of power dynamic that Saz is worried about. Psychiatrists get to decide what's mentally ill, and the individual can't really challenge that.
And what about the APA? Where did they stand on Donaldson's case?
Their brief took this, father knows best approach. They talked about the importance of treatment, saying Donaldson desperately needed it but couldn't see that himself. They argued that locking him up and treating him against his will was necessary for his own good, even if he didn't agree.
So their argument boils down to the experts know best, even if the person himself disagrees.
Exactly. And it raises this huge question. Who gets to decide what happens to someone's mind and body when they're labeled as mentally ill?
That leads us to the Supreme Court's decision in O'Connor v. Donaldson. What was the outcome of this landmark case?
The court ruled for Donaldson. They said states can't lock up people who aren't dangerous just because they're mentally ill. It seemed like a win for individual freedom, a pushback against psychiatric slavery.
But, like with most things, I'm guessing it's not that simple, right?
You got it. The reactions to the Donaldson decision were all over the place, even people on the same side, whether they were for or against institutional psychiatry, had wildly different interpretations of what the ruling meant.
It's like everyone saw what they wanted to see in the ruling and used it to push their own agenda. Kind of lost sight of Donaldson himself in all the noise.
Yeah, it's interesting how the Donaldson decision became this, mirror for everyone involved. Those who support institutional psychiatry, they saw it as just a small bump in the road, but the critics, they saw it as this, huge crack in the whole system.
And what about Kenneth Donaldson? What happened to him after he finally got out?
Well, after 15 years locked up, Donaldson did something kind of unexpected. He sued O'Connor in the hospital for damages.
Whoa, so he wasn't just content with being free. He wanted to hold them accountable for what they did to him. What was his lawsuit based on?
He argued that they violated his constitutional rights by keeping him locked up for so long without a good reason. Remember, they never thought he was dangerous, and he always refused treatment, especially because of his Christian Scientist beliefs.
That brings up some really interesting questions, like what even is treatment in a situation like that? And how much should someone's religious beliefs matter when deciding on treatment?
Those are the exact points Saz wants us to think about. He uses Donaldson's case to challenge the whole idea of forced treatment.
Yeah.
He says it's a contradiction. How can something be treatment if you're forcing it on someone who doesn't want it?
That's a good point. It's like saying, we're going to force you to have this medical procedure for your own good, even if you don't want it. That doesn't sound like treatment at all.
Exactly. Saz sees that as a total violation of individual autonomy, denying someone the basic human right to make decisions about their own body and mind.
Okay, so back to the lawsuit. Did Donaldson win?
He did. The court awarded him a pretty big sum in damages. They said O'Connor and the hospital staff definitely violated his rights.
So in the end, Donaldson got his freedom and some justice too, but his story and the way Saz analyzes it really shows how complicated and contradictory our mental health system is.
Absolutely. And it leads us to this core question that Saz keeps coming back to.
Which is
involuntary psychiatric treatment ever really justifiable?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's something people are still arguing about today, both in the mental health field and in society as a whole.
Saz's view is pretty radical. He says the whole concept of mental illness is problematic, that it's often used as a tool for social control, a way to enforce conformity and silence people who don't fit in.
So he's saying that instead of seeing mental illness as a medical condition, it's more like a social construct, a label used to control people who are different from the norm.
Exactly. And he argues that the power to define and diagnose mental illness lies with the psychiatric profession, which creates this dangerous power imbalance.
It's a really thought-provoking perspective.
Yeah.
It makes us question our own assumptions about mental health, about the role of psychiatry, and about the limits of individual freedom in society.
And that's one of the things I find so interesting about Saz's work. He's not afraid to ask these tough questions, to challenge the way things are, and to make us think critically about these complicated issues.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Saz compares psychiatric slavery to actual historical chattel slavery. That's a pretty bold comparison. How does he make that connection?
He argues that both systems work on a similar logic of dehumanization and control.
Okay.
Just like slave owners justified slavery by saying Africans were less than human, Saz believes that people who support involuntary psychiatric treatment justify their actions by saying the mentally ill can't make rational decisions for themselves.
So it's about making this other group, a group that's seen as not fit for freedom and needs to be controlled by someone more powerful.
Exactly. And Zaz says this logic is really about maintaining power and social order, not truly caring about the individuals involved. He suggests it's about who gets to define normal and who gets to decide what happens to those who don't fit that definition.
It's a pretty scary thought. But it also connects to a lot of issues we see today, right? Like how we deal with homelessness, drug addiction, or even political dissent. Do we see these as problems to be solved, or as individual choices we should respect?
That's a great point. Saz's work encourages us to look at the bigger societal forces at play. He's asking if we really value individual liberty or if we're more comfortable with a system that allows us to control and marginalize certain groups in the name of safety or order.
It reminds us that how we treat the mentally ill reflects our values as a society.
And Saz argues that language plays a big role in all of this.
Oh, how so?
He says both chattel slavery and psychiatric slavery rely on a system of language and rhetoric that hides the real power dynamics going on.
So how does language hide these systems of control? Can you give some examples?
Saz points to words like treatment, patient, and mental illness. He argues that these words can be used to make forced interventions seem like nice, caring acts, to make it seem like we're helping people when we're actually taking away their control.
So by using medical language, by focusing on the supposed good these interventions are doing, we create a story that makes it easier to ignore the power dynamics at play.
Precisely. And Saz wants us to be skeptical of this kind of manipulation with words. He wants us to look beyond the surface and see the real experiences of the people caught in these systems of control.
That's so important. Words have power, and they can be used to shape how we see reality, to justify actions that might otherwise seem wrong.
And when we're talking about mental health treatment, the stakes are incredibly high. The words we use can literally decide whether someone loses their freedom, gets forced into medical procedures they don't want, or is denied their basic human rights.
Saz doesn't hold back, does he? He criticizes his own profession, the psychiatric establishment.
He doesn't. And that's one of the things that makes his work so controversial. But it's also what makes it so important. He makes us face these uncomfortable truths about power, control, and the potential for abuse, even in systems that are supposed to be helping people.
He seems particularly concerned with what he calls the medicalization of mental illness, like this tendency to see all mental and emotional problems as purely biological.
You're right. Saz argues that focusing too much on the biological side of mental illness ignores the social, cultural, and existential parts of human experience.
Okay.
And those parts are crucial to understanding and addressing mental health challenges.
It's not that he denies biology plays a role. He's more worried that this medical model could be used as a tool for social control.
Exactly. He's saying that reducing complex human experiences to just brain chemistry or genetics takes away people's agency, their ability to make choices and be responsible for their own lives. And that makes it easier to justify forcing interventions to say, well, they're not really in control, so we need to step in and make decisions for them.
It's a slippery slope, for sure.
Yeah.
And it raises a lot of questions about how we define mental illness, the role of psychiatry in society, and the limits of individual freedom.
Saz's work challenges us to really think deeply about these issues, to question our assumptions, and to be aware of the potential for abuse, even within systems that are meant to help people.
And he doesn't just criticize. He offers other ways to think about mental health care.
Yeah.
He calls for a more holistic and humane approach that recognizes the dignity and agency of all individuals, even those who are struggling.
He emphasizes personal responsibility, allowing individuals to make their own choices, even if those choices seem unconventional or risky. He believes that real healing can only happen when people are free to choose their own paths.
It's a radical idea, especially in a society that often views mental illness with a paternalistic lens.
But it's also a deeply challenging one. It forces us to confront our own fears about mental illness, our anxieties about difference and nonconformity, and it asks us if true compassion means controlling people or giving them the power to make their own choices.
It's a lot to unpack. But one thing's clear. Saz's work makes us face some fundamental questions about how we see mental illness, the role of psychiatry in society, and the balance between individual liberty and societal control. He's really challenging us, isn't he? To rethink not just the problems in the mental health system, but also our own ideas about freedom and responsibility in society.
That's what makes Saz such a lightning rod. His ideas really speak to people who feel like the system is too quick to label people and throw pills at them, but they also make people nervous who worry about what could happen if we limit involuntary treatment.
He's been called anti-psychiatry, hasn't he? Like he's minimizing the suffering of people with mental illness and pushing for so much freedom that vulnerable people could get hurt.
Yeah, those criticisms have definitely been thrown his way. And it's important to say that not everyone in the mental health world agrees with Saz. Lots of psychiatrists and mental health professionals would totally reject how he describes their profession and how he defines mental illness.
It reminds us that this isn't about picking a side, being pro-Saz or anti-Saz. It's about grappling with these complex ideas, thinking about the potential good and bad, and figuring out how to balance individual freedom with protecting those who might be vulnerable.
And that's the real tough part. How do we make a mental health system that respects individual choice while also helping those who need it most? How do we find that balance between freedom and care?
It's like walking a tightrope. And Saz's work, even though it's controversial, makes us face that tension head on.
One thing Saz points out is the potential for harm when we rely too much on this, like, we know best attitude. When we think we know what's good for someone, even if they're struggling, we risk taking away their agency, their ability to make choices and own their lives.
It's easy to fall into that trap, though, right? Especially when someone's in crisis or acting in a way that seems dangerous or irrational.
Definitely. But Saz reminds us that even those labeled as mentally ill deserve the same respect and dignity as everyone else. They have the right to make their own choices, even if we think those choices are bad or weird.
It's a good reminder that our own fears and anxieties about mental illness can sometimes mess with our judgment. We might think we're helping, but we could actually be contributing to a system that takes away individual choice and just makes stigma worse.
And that's where language is so crucial. Saz wants us to pay attention to the words we use, to avoid language that dehumanizes and stigmatizes people. Instead, we should use language that promotes understanding, compassion, and respect.
It's about changing the conversation from us versus them to realizing that we're all in this together, that we all have strengths and weaknesses, and that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect.
Exactly. And Saz also wants us to think about mental health care in a more well-rounded way. He says it's not just about treating symptoms, it's about helping people live meaningful and fulfilling lives.
So going beyond just the medical model and thinking about the social, cultural, and existential parts of human experience.
Right. It's about dealing with the root causes of mental distress, like poverty, trauma, isolation, or a lack of purpose in life.
It's about making a society that supports well-being on all levels, not just through meds and therapy, but also through education, jobs, housing, and strong social ties.
It's about recognizing that mental health isn't just an individual problem, it's a societal problem.
That's a huge point. It's easy to get caught up in individual stories, diagnoses, and treatments, and forget that the world we live in has a huge impact on our mental health.
And that's why Saz's work is still relevant today. It's a call to action, a challenge to make a fairer and kinder society that truly supports everyone, not just those who fit neatly into normal or healthy boxes.
So after this deep dive into psychiatric slavery, what are some big takeaways for our listeners to chew on?
Well, Saz makes us face some tough truths about power, control, and the potential for abuse within the mental health system. It's a reminder to be critical, to question authority, to be skeptical of simple answers, and to fight for a fairer and more humane approach to mental health care.
And it's not just about changing the system, it's about changing our own hearts and minds. It's about examining what we believe about mental illness, about individual freedom, and about our responsibility to care for those who are struggling.
It's about finding a way to balance compassion with respect for autonomy, to help those in need without using force or control.
It's an ongoing conversation, and one that needs open dialogue, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge the way things are. It's been a fascinating deep dive into psychiatric slavery, a book that's sure to stick with us. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep those minds open and those conversations flowing.